Good afternoon and welcome. We're grateful that you could join us this afternoon for the inaugural William N. Rom Lecture on Environmental Justice, which aims to advance social impact at the intersection of environmental justice and climate change. We are thrilled to have both Dr. Rom and our keynote speaker, Congresswoman Grace Meng, with us to provide a current landscape of our planet's health as we observe Earth Day later this week. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, convened by the United Nations, released a report earlier this month warning that climate change can be mitigated, but we are very quickly running out of time. To explore this important topic further, it's now my distinct honor to introduce our facilitator, Dr. William Rom, the Sol and Judith Bergstein Professor of Medicine Emeritus, research professor with NYU School of Medicine, and research scientist with our School of Global Public Health at NYU. Bill was a young medical student on the occasion of the observance of the first Earth Day back in 1970. He has since devoted a large part of his career to climate change and global public health, which also happens to be the title of his most recent book on this subject. Please join me with a warm welcome for Dr. William Rom.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, Cheryl. Welcome to Earth Week, everybody, or 52 years that we've been having this celebration. And this lecture is a personal goal to orchestrate an annual thought leader discussion around climate change, an issue I've been involved with for the past 2 decades. Our keynote speaker today is a terrific choice for our inaugural lecture, Congresswoman Grace Meng, a longtime passionate advocate for protecting the environment. So Congresswoman Meng has been highlighted by the National Environmental Scorecard of the League of Conservation Voters. In 2021, she had a 100% voting record on 23 key votes in the House of Representatives, and she's been a champion for the environment. She has sponsored the Red Rocks Wilderness Act, trying to protect 9 million acres in Utah primarily, in the Intermountain West, including Canyonlands National Park and Horseshoe Canyon, where a few months ago I was hiking to the Great Gallery with archaic native petroglyphs. She's also a sponsor of an act to protect the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge Plain, of 1.5 million acres of grazing grounds for the porcupine caribou herd. She's been fighting to protect Long Island Sound and the Delaware Basin as well. As the mother of 2 young children, she's committed to ensuring that all children growing up in Queens and across the United States have drinkable water, breathable air, and safe and accessible parks. More sustainable practices will benefit both public health and the economy. It is critical that all of us act now to reduce harmful pollution, curb carbon emissions, and promote energy efficiency. We are very fortunate, and please join me in a warm NYU Global Public Health welcome for Congresswoman Grace Meng.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Dr. Rom, for the kind introduction and for your leadership. Thank you to Dr. Hilton and everyone at the NYU School of Global Public Health for inviting me here today to share remarks ahead of Earth Day this Friday. What an honor to be with all of you, and I'm so grateful for all of your work and leadership. 2 weeks ago, as you probably know, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change released its 3rd and final report on what we must do to mitigate the worst effects of climate change. According to the scientists in this report, we have until 2025, that is 32 months from now, for emissions to peak to keep global warming under 1.5 degrees Celsius. That is not a lot of time. Under the landmark 2015 Paris Climate Agreement, nations agreed to set voluntary emission reduction goals and established a pathway for developed nations to help developing nations meet their targets, and created accountability mechanisms to push countries to meet their goals. While each country is doing their part, we have to remember that this is a collective action problem. In other words, the nations of the world are on roller coaster riding up to the apex before the drop. Imagine there is a sign at the top, but you cannot easily read it. But as you get closer, you can read that it says the point of no return. That, folks, is what we're seeing today as we look to 2025. The signs are clear for the US. The West is burning, literally. There are tornadoes ravaging the South and severe weather events battering the Eastern seaboard, including our hometown here in New York City. As many of you know, 2021 was another year of frequent and costly storms. New York City was pummeled extra hard by the remnants of Hurricane Ida last September that resulted in multiple lost lives and economic damage. In my view, we can no longer point fingers or deny the facts of climate change. We must work together to leave behind a world for our children and grandchildren that is better than the one that we inherited. Collective problems require collective solutions, and that starts with American leadership. Under the Biden administration, the US rejoined the Paris Climate Agreement and tasked his National Climate Task Force to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 2030 and eventually reach net zero emissions economy-wide by the year 2050. Building on this foundation, President Biden also created a White House Office of Domestic Climate Policy. He appointed an international climate envoy and issued executive orders to center the issue of climate change in the federal government. These are unprecedented actions and very necessary as an important down payment to address climate change. And I'm proud to help support the president as New York senior member on our House Appropriations Committee. Our committee is responsible for funding the federal government and ensure that policies are truly working as they were intended when written. This past March, I helped pass a $1.5 trillion federal spending bill that included items like $14 billion of transformative investments in clean energy and science to develop and deploy clean, affordable, and secure American energy and create good paying American jobs at the Department of Energy. Another item was about $6 billion for NOAA so it can continue to focus on climate research, which provides actionable climate information to inform people's decisions about how to adapt to the changing climate. And also $125 million to the State Department's Clean Technology Fund to combat the climate crisis and help countries scale up low carbon technologies. And these are just some of the examples of federal programs that we are working on and supporting in Congress to help our country and the global community to reach peak emissions by 2025. And not only does our work start at home, it also continues abroad in our foreign policy. I hope this offers to all of you, incredible leaders, a glimmer of hope that while the window of action is quickly closing, we have the leadership and resources and dedication and heart to meet this moment. Thank you again for all of your incredible work. You are truly making a difference, and please don't hesitate to let me know if we can collaborate in different and creative ways. I so appreciate this chance to speak in front of all of you, and I hope you all have a very successful event, and thank you for the work that you do.
Thank you very much, Congresswoman Meng. May I ask you a question about whether Build Back Better's climate provisions will make it this spring? in the house across the divide called the United States Senate.
I have been in Congress long enough to know not to issue any predictions on timeline, but I've also been in Congress long enough to know that the most unexpected and positive things sometimes come about when we least expect it. Look, we all of you, me, my colleagues, have to continue to do our push. We wanted to pass the president's jobs and infrastructure plan overall. The part that made it a two-part bill doesn't necessarily have to, that's just process to me. What's most important that is we get the important parts that are within, not just within Build Back Better and also the infrastructure bill, but whatever needs to be passed, especially in the Build Back Better bill, whatever you want to call it, people who support Build Back Better, people who like some parts of Build Back Better, but we are definitely hopeful that, you know, we are still trying to get key parts across the finish line, and we have not given up. Whether that comes in the form of one large package or multiple, it's something that we continue to push, and we know that the president and the administration has been committed to many of the important pieces of the bill, and we're still working on it.
Okay, thank you very much. We appreciate your time and effort, and we will certainly be in touch with your office. We have 80 participants, and I expect you'll have 80 emails helping you out to fight this climate emergency.
Thank you so much.
Okay. For the audience, you may submit questions in the Q&A box, and I will try to respond to those. We're going to be joined by Dr. Sonali McDermid. Sonali is a faculty member at NYU as an associate professor in the Department of Environmental Studies. She has a background actually in physics of all things at NYU, and then she earned her doctorate at the Department of Earth and Environmental Sciences at Columbia, where she also did a postdoc at their Earth Institute. She's also very busy editing a journal called Earth Interactions, which focuses on landscapes and how they interact with the environment. This is a journal sponsored by the American Meteorological Society, the American Geophysical Union, and the American Association of Geographers. She's funded by several scholarships like Fulbright and Andrew Carnegie, where she studies food insecurity globally. So my background is more in medicine and public health, where I've been at NYU since 1989, working at the famous Bellevue Hospital with tuberculosis and HIV, graduating onto lung cancer and biomarkers, where I ran the Division of Pulmonary and Critical Care Medicine. And for the past 6 years, I have been with the School of Global Public Health, teaching a course on climate change and global public health, and an undergraduate course on environmental health in a global world. So we finished with Congresswoman Meng and some of the politics. Fortunately, we have a president who signs on to the climate crisis and calls it a existential threat to our planet and to our public health. He has declared that over the next 8 years, we need to get to 50 to 52% reduction in carbon pollution and reach net zero emissions by 2050. We're currently at about 6 billion metric tons of carbon pollution per year. The United States has been the leader over time in the production of carbon pollution. We probably are the leader in the per capita basis of carbon pollution. So we are certainly challenged to be a leader in ameliorating this tremendous problem. So CO2 is a gas along with methane. That's a greenhouse gas, and it results in trapping infrared radiation on the surface of the Earth, causing warming. We've warmed about 1.2 degrees centigrade globally, but much of that heat, if not the vast majority, has been captured in the oceans. So we've had a global warming that's caused public health as well as ecological effects. So it's been called climate change. The political class represented by Congresswoman Meng have a leadership role in developing policies that will protect us from carbon pollution. I mentioned Build Back Better, but the federal government has a role, and I'd like to ask Sonali her thoughts about the main features of this legislation, which were to provide subsidies and funding for the wind energy industry, for the solar energy industry, known as renewables, and the battery storage of all of this electricity. Since costs of solar have dropped about 90% in the past decade, the cost of wind energy have dropped about 50% in the last decade, so that this is the cheapest form of electricity going forward. How do we encourage this renewable energy industry to reach heights of doubling and tripling over the next decade in the production of electricity? How do we do this with government policies? And as Congresswoman Meng said, that this was some urgency because 2030 is only 8 years off and 2050 is only 28 years off. And likely we're all going to see this time. Are we going to make it?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. And thank you, Bill, for your introduction. And I wish I had all the answers for you for those kinds of questions. You know, I myself am not an energy expert per se. I'm a climate scientist, however. And what I will say is that there's several key points that you have just mentioned that I think are worth recapitulating and drawing out, right? One is that, you know, while there has been some help for these alternatives, when you compare them to the kinds of supports, subsidies or otherwise in kind, that the fossil fuel industry has received for however long now at this point, right? On the order since their inception. You know, I think it's a very positive thing overall that we have seen the prices of these alternatives drop so significantly over such a short period of time. I think that's a real testament to how these industries can scale up. And the kinds of demand that there are, right? It can be a highly competitive market, and it is a very competitive market. And that comes for better or for worse with a lot of the market dynamics that tend to govern how big industries like this scale up. And that can be good for the consumer and that prices are falling in a lot of cases. But I think we need to be mindful and considerate of looking at incentives for both the manufacturing, production, and rolling out the industrial development of these alternatives. And on the flip side of things, looking at consumers and looking at wants and needs across a whole range of consumers. And that also includes, for example, like it's getting cheaper for homeowners to be able to install solar panels and actually get really good warranties on those solar panels for the lifetime of most mortgages, in fact, now for some of the best solar panels that are out there. For those communities, however, that may not have as much access, underserved communities, communities where home ownership is not readily accessible or available. And this also qualifies for a lot of urban communities and peri-urban communities. We need to figure out a way of delivering energy justice, which is sort of another big component of what this administration has been focusing on in the DOE. We need to consider how we start to bring these affordable technologies, how to scale them on the manufacturing side of things, and how to marry them with opportunities for kind of consolidated, right, or for housing in communities that are densified, right, that kind of build up those urban environments. And so we need to figure out, how do we deliver energy justice? How do we enable wide swaths of the population to take advantage of these falling prices, of this emerging industry? How do we do that in an equitable way? And what are still the gaps in being able to access this? And that can come down to affordability. It can also just come down to information, knowing that there are opportunities and incentives out there for homeowners to take advantage of some of these things. Just making them available is not enough, right? We also need to raise awareness that energy proofing, that retrofitting, that being able to include some of these technologies at home are on the table for many people, and sometimes for people who don't necessarily think that those options are available to them. So I think there's a lot of coordination that needs to happen, both in the production side and the consumption side, and in the general awareness raising, in between those things. And that I think presents a lot of really great opportunities for Build Back Better and for this administration to ramp up.
Yes, I think discussing the technology aspect is important. For example, solar panels back in about 2010 were about 150 kilowatts in a panel. So I bought 6 of them for 900 kilowatts, and that's barely enough to keep a couple light bulbs going. When I toured the Jinko solar factory in China, they were at 425 kilowatts per panel, and the panels were about half the size, so that the technology has increased dramatically. And now there are layers that you can place on that increase the efficiency from in the 20% to the 30%. And so solar panels are not only going down in cost, they're beginning to get more powerful. The same is happening with wind turbines. It used to be that it was 1 to 2 to 3 megawatts, and now some of the companies are up to 5 and even up to 12 megawatts for a wind turbine. So they've become much larger and much more efficient. Apparently the lead technician job for the whole country right now is wind turbine technician. So there are opportunities, and there are opportunities for labor unions to organize these workers, which would ensure decent salaries going forward. And there's tremendous research and science happening on the batteries. One exciting point about the renewables is what's happening in the transportation industry. Virtually all of the automotive companies have declared 2035 or 2040 or even 2030 as a time point that they're going to electrify their entire fleets. So we now have a challenge of getting charging stations distributed along highways and certainly in cities to meet this demand for electric vehicles. At the vanguard of this probably will be school buses and buses in the city to electrify. It's slow, but there's a start, and we as citizens certainly could push them forward to electrify further. Do you have any comments on the transportation sector?
Yeah, I think that's, I mean, all your comments I completely agree with, and I think they're important. I think that there's a couple of things that I just want to add and try to keep in mind. And so, firstly, I think the trends in the automotive sector, right, and the declarations of these companies are really positive things that we should hold them accountable for, and moving forward in the future. I think it's also important as we start developing alternative technologies, batteries, for example, or the materials that go into these things, that we also consider the supply chains that give rise to them. I want to underscore, as a climate scientist, I feel very strongly about the climate crisis and that we need to be targeting in every possible way across every single sector. And with transportation and sort of renewables, the other thing that I would like to see is to ensure that the materials supply chains that contribute to the alternatives are not as equally detrimental. And so, of course, that will bring down greenhouse gases, but the mining of some of these alternative materials, have capacity. We can do them responsibly, or we can do them irresponsibly. And so I think we need to make some decisions now about how we intend to govern supply chains for renewables, particularly within the transportation sector. And I think these automotive companies have an opportunity to rethink the way that we supply materials for that sector in particular. The other thing I will say about transportation is that there's several things that need to happen. One is sort of the electrification and the sustainability within how we use different forms of transport, how often we use different forms of transport, and what they're, what effectively what those supply chains are. The other component is their use, and that, if we can mobilize to invest in better public transportation systems around our cities and around areas that will be consolidating half, if not more, of the population in the future. We need to be able to develop transportation systems and invest in them in ways that they will be sustainable, not just environmentally, but just economically, socially over time. So I think that in addition to thinking about mitigating greenhouse gas emissions from vehicles and modes of transportation itself, we also need to think about the social structures and settings around that, and how we use them and how we incentivize the use of alternative transportation systems. So I think all of those things need to be changing and thought about at the same time.
Yes, I think supply chain issues are very important. These issues are at the forefront nowadays. Lithium is a critical element for batteries in automobiles. And the largest American lithium deposit is in Nevada at a place called Thacker Pass. And there's a mining company proposing to mine this. However, the Shoshones and Paiute tribes feel that they have been inadequately consulted. And some of the ranchers near there are very concerned about the groundwater supply from this mining venture. Berkshire Hathaway is involved in a very large lithium extraction project in the Salton Sea in the southern part of California. And then we need nickel. There's one nickel mine in America near Marquette, Michigan. It's an underground mine, and they dump their tailings underwater in an old iron mine pit. There's a very large nickel deposit straight west of Duluth, Minnesota, at a town called Tamarack. Someone by the name of Elon Musk has already invested $1.5 billion with a B as in boy, and Talon Metals to open this nickel mine in Minnesota. There are other copper nickel mines in Minnesota, one in open pit, another underground, that have been proposed, and both of them have threats to a state with 10,000 lakes and rivers in it. It's not like mining in Arizona, where it's very arid. So we do have environmental justice constraints with developing these supply chains. So lately, we've heard a lot about the Department of Defense and security, that much of our development of renewable energy is important for our national security. Along that theme of security, is also food security. We understand that agriculture is probably responsible for 20% or more of carbon pollution. CO2 is emitted from the various tilling practices. Nitrous oxide, another greenhouse gas, is emitted from fertilizers. And then methane is emitted in rice paddies, burps from cows, and so on and so forth. So agriculture is critical to the development of decarbonization. So I was wondering if you could address some of these things. And some of the climate deniers say CO2 is good for photosynthesis and you'll have more green plants. But as you have climate change, the temperature goes up, and the higher temperature means that you have less nutrients in some of these grains like rice and millet and wheat, and also crop sizes will go down. And on top of that, you have droughts and floods. And so agriculture going forward, feeding 9 billion people in 2050 is going to be severely constrained. So how do you fix all of this?
Yeah, well, that is the ultimate question. You throwing out the hard ones right away, right? Right, crazy. No, I think everything. So I appreciate what you've highlighted here, because I think what you've highlighted are two dimensions of this, well, two sides of this coin, and then there's some overlap in between this, right? One, we know that climate change is already impacting food security, and crop production is one way that it does that. Overwhelmingly, that's probably what we understand best. But there are other ways as well too, right? Food security is the combination of availability, which is the production side of things, access and utilization. And so availability is just one pillar of food security. The access, the utilization is also important. And we know that climate change will impact that. On the flip side, as you've actually, summarized very nicely, Bill, is the fact that agriculture has a massive global footprint. And contributes significantly, about a quarter of global greenhouse gas emissions, and perhaps more depending upon what you include in the agricultural supply chain. And even if we extend beyond climate change, again, right, these problems are actually, in some ways, they encompass more than just greenhouse gas emissions alone. Agriculture is the primary. 70% of our freshwater withdrawals go towards agriculture, 70% globally. In the US, it's about 40%. In South Asia and parts of Southeast Asia, it can get up to about 80 to 90% of freshwater withdrawals. Agriculture is also the biggest driver of biodiversity loss. Land use, land cover change is the biggest driver of biodiversity loss, of which agriculture is a major part, and of moving beyond safe operating spaces for biogeochemical flows. So we have excess nitrogen, excess phosphorus, excess nutrients entering our system. Not only does that lead to cascading effects in nitrous oxide emissions, as you've mentioned, but it also leads to nitrate pollution, dead zones, right, coastal runoff, and pollution of waterways. Air pollution can also be linked in rural areas to the nitrogen cascade and the resulting pollutants that come off of a manure management, for example. So we're not just talking about climate change here. We're talking about a host of issues, of which climate change is just one, associated with agriculture. And of course, this is not touching some of the social costs of agriculture displacement. So how do we fix it? Well, there are options. And in some ways, agriculture, I would argue, is a little bit more of a challenging problem, because we are actually seeing very strong mitigation measures and trends across transportation, across energy. And we're not quite seeing that yet in agriculture. And so while writ large globally, energy is probably the biggest player, and there's more actually options for mitigation on those fronts than for agriculture at this point, proven at least. And so for agriculture, I think several things need to be done. We need to improve and become better at farming what we do so that we can reduce the footprint of agriculture. This includes in particular ensuring that we stop now right away deforestation. That needs to stop. And we need to consider our land use footprint. It also means that we need to practice agriculture in a way that can help sequester carbon. Now, I say that with caution because keeping that carbon in the ground from an agricultural perspective is extremely difficult. But there are many things that we could do to get better at producing. And there are options also on the consumption side of things, getting smarter about what we eat, eating balanced diets, eating diets that are heavy on plant products and plant-based vegetables, fresh fruits and vegetables. Much of the world doesn't have regular access to the micronutrients within these fresh fruits and vegetables, right? And so that makes them particularly vulnerable. And then on top of that, you layer climate change and the production shocks that come with climate change, and it can further compromise not just food security, but nutrition security as well too. So I think that there are options on both the production and the consumption side of things, but agriculture is a thorny problem because it's not just the solar panels and energy or just wind or one option. We actually need to do at least a little bit, if not a lot, on many different things in order for agriculture to become part of the solution space. And so I think, to the extent that we are making food security a priority for agriculture versus other products that may not be supplying food security, that we really collect more data and start to try to understand these climate processes, these biogeochemical processes, that we can improve agricultural production, and we start to consider what does a climate smart diet also look like, and how do we start to incentivize that in culturally appropriate ways. These are also things that we need to be considerate of.
Yes. In Nature this past week, there's an article that states realization of Paris Agreement pledges may limit warming just below 2 degrees centigrade.
Yeah.
So this is the good news, that if we actually live up to our Paris 2015 pledges and updated for COP26 in Glasgow last fall, we can make it. We can stay below 2 degrees centigrade. One question is how do we keep ourselves on track? What kinds of sticks do we have? We have carrots, certainly, but how are we going to achieve 50 to 52% reduction in carbon pollution in the United States in 8 years as Biden's goal, especially looking forward to midterm elections this coming November? Do you have any ideas addressing that?
I think one important thing, in framing that question is that, and one thing I really want to underscore is that, if we wait any longer, it might be, but this is not an issue of technology or can we do this, right? I mean, this is not a scientific issue. This is a decision, right? This is a decision that we make together, that we make as a society to do, right? And that is to curb and cut as much as possible, as quickly as possible within the next few years, right? And if you start to look, and that is a very hopeful statement, it is limiting to about 1.8, 1.9, depending upon what scenario you look at there. It does require that countries meet not just their unconditional, right? They've got a portion that is the unconditional that they will do whatever it takes to do. And then there's a conditional component to that. And so it does require that countries meet their highest ambitions. And so, I think what we need to do is, to the extent that we are making decisions about drilling, which we are at this point in time in response to the global energy crisis that is hitting us in the wake of this war, I think it's very important that we weigh those decisions very, very carefully moving forward. And I think that this is very much a matter of not just politics, but also public pressure and the decision making that comes under public pressure. So this is not, in other words, it's not a question for a climate scientist or a technology expert. This is a question for those that are in a situation or empowered to make decisions, because this is a decision that we're going to have to make in order to get between here in the next 5 years or here in 2030, really, in order to meet these goals. And it needs to start as soon as possible.
Yes, President Biden just made a decision to open additional federal public lands to oil and gas drilling in the western United States. He decided to constrain this in terms of acreage and increased royalty payments, but still we don't need, we need to keep all the oil and gas in the ground from here on going forward. He also has on his desk a huge project called the Willow Project, WILLOW. It's a portion of the National Petroleum Reserve just west of Prudhoe in Alaska. This would provide 30 years of oil and gas for Conoco, and would provide several hundred million barrels of oil. So hopefully this project will not go forward. So we need to keep the pressure on. One of the questions from the audience was, how do we as a society and as an advocate of good government build climate change plans that account for energy inflation, maintaining electricity availability as we convert to clean energy? So this looks at price. If you look at price, driving an electric vehicle versus a gas vehicle, the pennies per mile are about a third in an EV compared to a gas vehicle. For taking a hot shower or heating water, it's pennies using electricity versus gas-powered generation of heat. I will say that one of my pet peeves is the gas stove. Everybody in New York City seems to love a gas stove, but gas stoves emit particulate matter. They emit nitrogen dioxide, carbon monoxide, as well as leaks of methane all along the pipelines. So this is a huge CO2 generator, and we are the end product users. So we need some kind of policy, first of all, stopping gas stoves in new buildings, which was almost in the budget for New York State for 5 years from now in 2027, but it didn't make it over the finish line when our governor put the budget to the legislature. So we need to have new buildings without these mandatory gas hookups. Just as a price point, I went to a store at Best Buy and looked at the stoves, and everything was gas. I couldn't believe the manager didn't have electric stoves. So I went online, found an electric stove, purchased it for $1,200, had it shipped to my apartment. The person in charge of our apartment building was aghast, saying, "What kind of green person are you? You're causing me all kinds of headaches." But I got him to install the stove and a 240 volt hookup with a couple holes in the wall cost even more than the stove cost. And then putting in new drywall and what have you and painting it. So there is an upfront cost. But my goodness, my apartment smells so much better now. I don't have that gas smell, and it's a hazard for asthma and so on. So another question from our audience was, how can we promote civics education in New York City, given the importance of legislation to promote our planet and democracy? Do you have any ideas about education?
Yeah, I think I saw another question in there too about, is the K-12 education system doing enough to educate next generation the climate science mitigation efforts? And education is receiving a lot of challenges from many different angles these days. And I think young people are deeply aware and carry a lot of the weight of the climate crisis on their shoulders. We're seeing that publicly, but I think there's also a component of it that's very private. And so something that I think that they're much more aware of than even I was sort of coming up through my career. And so I think, I think to the extent that students are aware and perhaps are talking about it, there's definitely more environmental science and climate change exposure that students get in schools today than I think that we did, or even that they got maybe 5 to 10 years ago. So I think the trends are actually good. Are they getting enough? They're clearly getting enough exposure to the problem to know that it's a problem. And part of that may not necessarily be school alone. That also might be the Greta Thunbergs of the world that are actually making themselves known and actually, and marching for these things. So I'm not sure it's so much a matter of exposure, although learning it, in a structured way, I think I would always argue there's room for improvement and to integrate that. And many teachers are doing that. I think in terms of the civics component, how to engage, right? I think activism has become kind of trendy these days. And I don't necessarily think that's such a bad thing. I think trying to introduce structured curricula of how students, to students, of how do we engage in our democracy, right? And what does it mean to be part of that democracy? This is something that teachers have been teaching in our schools for a very long time. And I think ramping that up and translating that for the current era of all these crises that we face, and how to ensure that your voice is heard, right? And not just in terms of who you vote for, but also your money is also your vote, right? How you actually engage with some of the major public and private actors, how you understand how those public and private actors are related to each other. I think these are the kinds of connections that would be great for schools to draw out more, so that citizens, right, eventually can be informed of where these connections lie and where the leverage points and levers are, right? What to actually ask for, what to actually argue for when you're out there making a vote or being activated on a particular issue. So I think, I give our schools and our teachers a lot of credit for what they do. I think that we have opportunities now to take these current events and take these current modes of activation that young people are displaying and really try to put that into a structured approach at the in the K through 12 or at least in high school phase of their lives. And I think that translates really well to their next steps then as they enter the workforce or go to college. And so I think it's a great question. And I do give our teachers a lot of credit, but they're also working against a lot just in terms of being resourced as well too. And so I think we need to support what's currently going on and try to figure out how we can resource our schools better to make these connections into the real world.
Yes, we have a number of questions concerning corporate behavior, such as ESG, environmental social governance, and how do we motivate corporations to be good citizens. So part of this is government regulation. There's the Federal Reserve that provides an overview of interest rates for borrowing. And the Federal Reserve needs to be challenged to consider climate as part of their considerations for making money available for banks. Recently, Jamie Raskin's wife was up for the key position at the Federal Reserve that would consider climate as part of their decision-making process. There's something called Dark Money, a book written by Jane Mayer. And she's recently written an article that I would recommend in the New Yorker magazine. I think it's this week. It's called The Slime Factor. It's how dark money and can support organizations that then criticize and actually smear individuals so that they aren't approved for these federal appointments. So Ms. Raskin was actually voted down in the Senate when Joe Manchin announced that he would vote against her. So there's another way we can get oversight of corporations, and that's through the Securities and Exchange Commission. The SEC has a new rule that climate considerations be taken seriously. And this rule was recently promulgated, but Congress has had other feelings, and this rule may not see the light of day now. So there is dark money involved, which is a group of very wealthy individuals provide funding to organizations that block initiatives to combat climate change. Some of these are coming through our former president's funds that are put into these dark money organizations. So there's important political pathways that we need to be involved in to ensure proper governance in our institutions. Do you have any ideas on how we urge corporations into better behavior, including banks? 85% of the banks don't have a climate policy. How do we urge these very important players who provide the funding for fossil fuel projects as well as renewable energy projects? How do we keep them from going in the wrong direction?
Yeah, and I think the dark money component, well, regulation, as you mentioned, the dark money component is one thing. I mean, there's also things that are just even more transparent than that are problematic, right? And this is, people on boards of companies, right, or in the company leadership, providing donations, right, to politicians for re-election campaigns and things like that, right? The whole sort of mantra of getting money out of politics is very real when it comes to this. I think also, regulation or mandates that hold companies accountable for doing and making public internal audits, right? Of what are the greenhouse gas emissions along your supply chain? How are you tracking that? What do you consider part of your supply chain, and what do you leave out? For the things that you're leaving out, what is your oversight of contractors that incur their own emissions, and for that matter, not just emissions, but human rights abuses, anything else like that along the supply chain. We need to ensure that companies are reporting these things. So shareholders, I think, should be like putting pressure on shareholders to demand this kind of transparency from companies is, I think, one major leverage point, particularly for publicly traded companies, right? That I think we could start, and that's kind of a separate tactic, right? So instead of going for the companies themselves or going for elected representatives that can put pressure on companies, now you start targeting the shareholders. And I think you'll start to see some more movement along those lines once you do that. For banks as well, too. I mean, there have been, individual divestment campaigns that may or may not work very well. But at the same time, I think that public pressure on big banks to again, hold and hold accountable and start requesting and accessing information for the kinds of enterprises that they do fund, right? And requiring statements and audits and evaluations of what risks are. Risks are another way to do this, right? And so another way to kind of think about this is that all of these companies, whether you're in oil and gas or big agriculture or wherever, you will also incur climate risks from the very problem that they are contributing to, right? And so looking at, for example, what climate risks these companies actually are subject to by their own creation, and then putting pressure on insurance companies to make sure that they're not insured for those kinds of things is another leverage point that we could be exercising some more. There are organizations that companies are now voluntarily reporting to, like the Carbon Disclosure Project, for example, where they are once they join, asked to evaluate and provide statements relating to greenhouse gas emissions, and then where it applies land use land cover change and some other metrics. And so I think that's one way to start digging in and hold companies accountable, but a lot of that is not made public. And what is just tends to be couched in a more rosy way than what they're actually reporting. And so I think that, and that takes effort. It takes someone to have to go through these things and evaluate what companies said they do, benchmark them, and figure out what is their progress towards doing them. There is, for example, a nonprofit in the UK called Influence Map, and their goal is to effectively, look through company reports, see what kinds of commitments they made, and then assess progress of those companies towards those commitments. Most of these commitments for climate tend to be very underwhelming. Somebody mentioned greenwashing in the chat. And even to the extent that the commitments are not that ambitious, companies are still not meeting those commitments across the swath of companies that Influence Map, for example, is looking at. So I think we need, in addition to regulation, we need ways, standardized scorecards, right, to keep track of these companies, and then figure out who are the people that need to be held accountable publicly, which I think are the shareholders. And then find other leverage points like insurance companies that can constrain how these corporate entities act. All of that is extremely unpopular, right, for a host of reasons, particularly in the United States. But if we are serious about the climate crisis, then these are things we have to entertain.
I'd like to address some of the challenges of environmental justice. We have counties in the South, for example, in North Carolina, that are majority minority, and those counties have huge hog farms, chicken farms. They now use some of the waste as energy for biomass power plants, so that there's additional exposures to these communities. There's plants being built in Louisiana and what's called Cancer Alley, where they're going to produce hydrogen, but they're going to use natural gas as a feed source. And they claim that they will capture CO2 and store it underground. But this is additional corporate pollution in these minority communities. And looking globally, the Northern Hemisphere has been the major carbon polluter, and the Southern Hemisphere is primarily exposed. So that as part of these Paris agreements, there's a green climate fund of $100 billion to support clean energy in developing nations. We've never reached that 100 billion per year goal. And what are your thoughts about these environmental injustices?
This is critical. I mean, the fact that we have not come close to reaching the $100 billion mark is actually, I mean, to me, it's just, it's not right. And that was something that, and when we do tend to dole out dollars, they tend to be with the tagline of "you must also mitigate" versus just adapt. And for many of these countries, across the semi-arid tropics, subtropics, tropical countries, that those that have come out of are in a post-colonial stage of their own development. Right, that are many countries are incredibly in debt, This is a difficult thing to stomach. And so, you know, for several developing countries, right? One of the provisions so first of all, to meet the 2 degrees C, or just to get to that just below 2 degrees C target, we need to ensure that every country meets the full capacity of their NDC, their nationally determined contribution. For countries that are developing, that requires that they meet also their conditional goals. Those conditional goals are often predicated on getting funds to help them transition their energy, you know, their energy systems, their agricultural systems, you name it. And that is not going to come without the help of industrialized countries, big emitters, big polluters, contributing their fair share towards this goal. And so it's important to recognize that our success overall is not just limited to what we do in the United States. It also depends on how we transfer knowledge, aid transfers of knowledge between these countries, and transfer funds and restitutions in some regards to these countries. And so we're kind of all in this together. I'll just quickly name one example, because you sort of brought this back with the supply chains, talking about mining across different areas of the United States and in indigenous nations across the US. You know, 70% of our cobalt, which is important for battery production for electric vehicles in particular, 70% comes from Congo alone. And there are small scale as well as large scale mining operations happening there with very little regulation imposed upon those, right? And so here we have a country that's, you know, facilitating in large part our transition towards a renewable economy. And yet, right, we are impeding their ability, right, to transition in a more sustainable way, possibly even to meet their own targets. And so I think that it's important that we understand that we cannot go it alone to solve the climate crisis as one nation, and that we do have legacies and obligations across the developing areas, not just us alone, but the entire sort of industrialized big emitters, right, our big polluters of the world. And so thinking about how we serve that justice, not just from a climate standpoint, but from these other legacies, you know, that occurred, you know, before we started tackling the climate crisis, we need to be considerate of how we do that while moving forward to a more sustainable future. So, so I think that that is a very important component of this, and we will not. I mean, I can tell you this, we will not get to 2 degrees C if we are not also thinking about serving justice. That needs to be part and parcel of this entire equation.
With that, we'll sum up the hour and thank everybody. And thanks Sonali McDermid for her participation, Congressman Grace Meng, and Dean Hilton. And for all the audience, we have tremendous opportunities going forward to achieve environmental justice and to decarbonize not only the United States, but the entire globe. So we have a lot of work to do, and it'll be very exciting. And thank you very much for everyone's time, patience, and happy Earth Week, and look forward to Friday's Earth Day. Thank you very much, everybody.